Hello and welcome to the second to last, the penultimate list of my top 50 favourite films. And as I always begin this, they're not the best films, they're my favourite films. So this is totally subjective to films that have connected with me personally. And we are into the top 20. So we're into the films that just missed out on the top 10, but are films that I absolutely love and keep coming back to again and again. So let's get started. And we are up to number 20, which is Ghostbusters. Yeah, Ghostbusters, 1984, absolute 80s classic. And Ghostbusters is one of those films that I never get sick of watching, and every time I watch it, I realise that it's one of my favourites. In fact, it's so much of a favourite that I sometimes take it for granted and leave it off lists like this. But then when I watch it again, I think, yeah, what a great film. Really, really funny, brilliant performances from Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray, Harold Ramis, you name it. Great ensemble cast of comedians, and quite inventive as well for a comedy. It kind of almost goes into horror territory with the ghosts, obviously, and the spirits, but is very much a family film as well, and definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. Ghostbusters in at number 20. In at number 19, we have, I think, the first mockumentary that was ever made, paving the way for things like Alan Partridge and The Office and that kind of humour. We have Spinal Tap. Spinal Tap is a film about a fading band from the 60s and 70s who are kind of falling onto hard times in their world tour in the 80s, and it's so well observed. If you've ever been a musician, you've ever been in a band, then you will definitely recognise some of the scrapes and the funny situations that they get into, and also some of the great kind of the arrogance and the Arrested Development and all those sort of things that you get from being in a band. And yeah, it's really, really funny. It's one of those, again, like Holy Grail and Life of Brian, that you could quote whole scenes from. I could sit and watch the whole of Spinal Tap and just quote it from beginning to end. Which wouldn't be very fun for anyone watching it with me, I'm sure. It's, like I say, paved the way for a lot of those mockumentaries. And at the time, I think a lot of bands actually thought it was about them, which just shows how close to the bone it got. Okay, that is number 19. At number 18, we have the wonderful One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is Jack Nicholson at his very best. And it concerns an inmate who convinces his parole board that he is criminally insane and gets put in an insane asylum. And he very quickly realises that life in an insane asylum isn't what he expected it to be, isn't the easy ride that he thought. And there's the wonderfully maniacal Nurse Ratched, who becomes his real enemy in this, and it's all about him trying to gain physical freedom and also mental freedom from the constraints of living in the asylum. And every single character in it is wonderful and really makes the story, and it's very heartwarming, also very tragic at times, and really makes you think about the human condition and sort of personal liberty and things like that. And definitely moves me every time I watch it, especially the end of the film, which I won't give away. Okay, next up we have possibly the most iconic film of all time, in at number 17, The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is like nothing that's come before or since, really. It's just spellbinding from beginning to end. taking in a few of the Frank L. Baum, I think it is, his fairy tales of the Land of Oz, but it's one of those films that is so ahead of its time that you could tell me it was made in the 50s, 60s, or even 70s, and I'd believe you. But when you find out that this groundbreaking film was made the same year as World War II began, 1939, it really is an incredible piece of work, and has stood the test of time pretty well. It's quite scary for a kid's film at times. The witch is particularly good in it, quite harrowing in her performance. I certainly remember her from when I was a kid, and it was reruns on telly. It's funny, it's moving, it's artistically astounding. My favourite bit of the film actually involves the use of the technology. It starts in black and white, or kind of sepia tone, and then in the normal world. But as she gets to Oz and opens the door, she opens the door to a full coloured screen, which I think is a really beautiful way of doing it, really. I'd love every piece of new technology to be introduced in that way. You sort of open a door and you're suddenly in a new, a brave new world. But yeah, she opens the door and that sepia tone, I still don't know how they did it. It sort of wipes from left to right, becomes from sepia into glorious Technicolor. And it's just something else, really, to think that they were producing something like that in 1939. Yeah, fantastic. The Wizard of Oz. If you haven't seen it, it's just essential viewing for any movie fan, and there's nothing quite like it. Okay, coming in at number 16, we have another Hitchcock, and it's on a lot of Hitchcock fans' top lists. It's Psycho. Psycho, when he made Psycho, he was actually going through a bit of a rough time. Some of his films previously had not done so well at the box office, and he made Psycho, believe it or not, on a shoestring. Part of the reason why it's black and white was to save money. But it, like Wizard of Oz, it breaks so many rules, so much new ground. It actually changed the way that people watched films in the cinema, believe it or not. Before Psycho, people used to sort of go into the cinema, watch a whole film, and then if they wanted to, stay and watch another film and another film. And they could sort of come in halfway through a film and things like that. Hitchcock said that because of all the twists and turns in Psycho, which I won't go into, he made the proviso that people were not allowed into the film once it had started. And that's kind of how we watch modern films nowadays. You line up and you go in at the beginning of the film and watch till the end and then come out again. And that is all due to Psycho. But so many other techniques, incredible techniques, were employed in Psycho, as well as the music. Bernard Herrmann did some incredible music. You always remember that kind of the stabs of the strings in the infamous shower scene. When I first saw Psycho, it lost a little bit of its edge because I already kind of knew the twists, and it's one of those films that is more shocking if you don't know the sort of the plot twists that are going to happen, which again I won't tell you here just in case you've not seen it. But yeah, it's the acting in it is also wonderful. Janet Leigh is really good. I like her main character because she's quite flawed. She's not the sort of perfect heroine that you're used to seeing in films. And also Norman Bates, as played by Anthony Perkins, is just superb. It's really iconic performance from him. And you can really believe that people would be taken in by his kind of approachableness and his, is that a word? and friendliness, and yeah, he was actually a sort of teen heartthrob singer before he got into movies, so you can see that he is perfect as the sort of psychopath in this, because often, as we've discovered in real life cases, psychopaths aren't always the people that we expect. They don't always look like monsters. Then in fact, they're often a bit like Norman Bates, very off-putting in the fact that they're so normal, and he plays that beautifully. The cinematography is incredible, and it's just, again, one of those films that you just have to watch. If you're a film fan, you have to watch Psycho. Okay, now on to number 15, and another iconic film. It's Metropolis. Now, Metropolis, again, it's one that's a very early film, and is not going to be to everyone's taste. Very arty, but so influential on science fiction films that came afterwards. Metropolis tells the story of the metropolis, the big city, and the sort of decadence of the upper class living on top of these huge skyscrapers, and the sort of toil and grim life of the kind of working class living down below in the sort of depths of the city, keeping it all ticking over. And yeah, very kind of almost like visual Marxism really going on there. And I love the very obvious idea that the visual idea that the upper class are at the top of the skyscrapers and the working class are at the bottom, sort of holding them up and having all that difficulty on their behalf, sort of thing. It's again beautifully shot, and the cinematography is incredible. It's amazing to think, when you look at Metropolis, that all the model shots of the skyscrapers and things were actually before the skyscrapers in New York and things like that. And I love the kind of the Art Deco design and just the inventiveness of Fritz Lang and the sort of expressionist German visual cinematography that he brought over from Germany to the United States. And it's just it's an incredible piece of art. And that's Metropolis. At number 14 is, I think, my second favourite Hitchcock film. Although it's one of those films that keeps climbing up the ranks every time I watch it. It is Vertigo. Now, Vertigo is one of those films that when I first saw it, I thought was okay. But the more you watch it, the more it kind of infects you. It gets inside of you. It really moves you and takes you to weird places. It's quite a trippy film, and it centres around the obsession of Jimmy Stewart's character, who is taken on to try and solve the mystery of his friend's wife, who has become obsessed with a dead woman who looks very much like her. And the further Jimmy Stewart gets into this mystery, the more obsessed he becomes himself with this woman. And it's weird to see, because I'm used to seeing, I mean, Jimmy Stewart, I tend to see him as like the 1950s equivalent of Tom Hanks. He's very good at playing the everyman, the sort of very relatable, nice guy that everyone can get behind and everyone likes. So obviously he was great in films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Harvey, and tends to play those sort of gentlemanly characters really well. But in Vertigo, it's interesting to see our main character get more and more almost deranged as it goes through the film. Another thing that I love about this film is its abundant use of colour. You can tell this is one of the first sort of colour films, and it really, uses colour to great effect. There's a particularly good vivid nightmare that the main character has that really psychedelic and full of colour, and uses colour really, really well. So that is Vertigo. At number 13 we have Marion Max, a Australian and American animation film, claymation film. This film I kind of saw by accident. I'd been to the Corner House in Manchester, a sort of art house cinema that was, it's sadly no more, and to see Metropolis that I was talking about before. And in the next screen across the way, they were showing Marion Max, and I saw a poster of it with these kind of strange claymation figures and thought, wow, this looks just like my kind of movie. So I had some extra time at the time, so I paid the good man and went in to see Marion Max, and so glad that I did, because it's possibly the most moving animated film that I've ever seen in my life. In fact, it amazes me every time I see it how emotionally moving it is. I always come out in absolute tears after seeing it. It follows a young girl who's very lonely and decides on a whim to make a new friend by picking at random a number in a phone book and ringing them up. I'm writing to them. And she does that and gets in touch with a guy called Max, who lives in New York. And Max is an older guy, but he has Asperger's and is very lonely himself. And they strike up this weird kind of friendship over the years, writing to each other as pen pals. And they help each other through particularly difficult times. Mary goes through a particularly bad divorce. Max has to come to terms with his Asperger's and not understanding the sort of social cues around him, and all sorts of problems that he gets into because of that. But it's a beautiful film, and definitely worth watching. It's very, very moving. It's not what you expect at all. It's got that great mixture of being very, very funny but very, very moving at the same time. And I find films like that very realistic, because there's that fine line between tragedy and comedy, isn't there? And I think it rides that line really, really well. So that's Mary and Max. At number 12 we have another great comedy, Some Like It Hot. Some Like It Hot follows a couple of jazz musicians who witness the gangland shooting on the Valentine's Day massacre, which doesn't sound like a comedy, but stay with me. And they decide to hide themselves away from the gangsters who are following them by dressing up as women and hiding themselves into an all-girls jazz band featuring the late great Marilyn Monroe. And it's obviously, as you can imagine, they both end up falling in love with Marilyn Monroe and not being able to share their identity. Tony Curtis then takes on another identity as a sort of oil salesman doing a great Cary Grant impression. And it's that Billy Wilder script, very wry, very sarcastic, very witty, and just brilliant from beginning to end. Great music, great acting, great comedy trio of Marilyn Monroe, Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, and the brilliant script of Billy Wilder. Definitely worth watching that one. And then coming in at number 11, just missing out on the top 10, we have my favourite Muppets film, Muppets Take Manhattan. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth have you got a Muppets film so high in the ranks? Well, this is the Muppet film that I first fell in love with as a kid, and it's possibly one of the most emotional of the Muppets films, along with Muppet Christmas Carol, which has already made this list. And I love the music. I love the way the characters are all it's basically, it's all the Muppet performers at their very best. A great team of puppeteers and character actors with Frank Oz, Jim Henson, Kevin Clash, etc. And it's just a great Muppet film. It shows them going from their college days to trying to get a show on in Manhattan. And it's if you watch any Muppets film, then make it Muppets Take Manhattan. Okay, there we go. We are through number 20 to number 11. So it only remains for me to take you into the top 10 of my favourite films. So I hope you can stay tuned for that. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Please like, subscribe and do all those things below, and I'll talk to you very soon. Thank you.